Okay, welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get things started. Welcome to Datasource Consulting and our educational webinar series. Today's presentation is part 2, Data Story Preparation, Delivering for Impact. And we are joined by our guest speaker, Jed Somerton. Very excited to have him as a guest presenter today. Before I introduce Jed, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Datasource Consulting and why we're experts in this space. Okay, so Datasource Consulting, think of us as a pure play consulting firm. We specialize in enterprise data management, modern data warehousing and architectures, and decision intelligence. And in October of 2016, we were acquired by EXL Services, and the analytics arm in particular, which has been a great marriage, right? Because they provide predictive and advanced analytics, machine learning, and robotics. And so it's very exciting now that from a data and decision intelligence perspective, that we now can offer the whole plethora of services end-to-end, from design and requirements review all the way up to delivering those advanced analytics that we're all looking for. So that's a little bit about Datasource Consulting. We do that through both our strategic arm that does a lot of roadmaps, project plans, assessments, data governance strategy, environmental evaluations, vendor tool selection, health checks for your data environment. And then we also have the doers, the developers, the architects, the analysts that really lock arms with the internal team to deliver on our recommendations. And basically, where the rubber meets the road, right? Working together with your team to build out the solution. So with that, let me now introduce you to Jed. Jed has been an executive for many, many years, working in large international IT organizations. He loves applying the insights of data science to improve organizational performance. That's where it's at. He's built analytic capabilities and delivered data-driven results in Fortune 500 companies, as well as over 100 companies in developing and operating their large-scale data and analytics systems. And he's done this in a number of industries: healthcare, telecommunications, financial services, manufacturing, and retail. So he's got a wide breadth of experience in this space. In addition to that, he is also a faculty member at TDWI, which stands for the Data Warehouse Institute, and he is also a faculty instructor at the Daniels College of Business for the University of Denver, working in the business Department of Business Information and Analytics. So with that, very excited to have Jed on board. I'm Deborah Langer. I'm your host. I'm VP of Sales. My job here is to make sure that the webinar goes smoothly. And so with that, let me just pass the baton over to Jed. He's going to do a recap of Data Storytelling Part 1, and then we'll go right into the new content.
Well, Deborah, thank you, and thank you for joining. And if you happen to see Part 1, I appreciate you coming back. And if you haven't yet seen it, you can go back and review it on Datasource Consulting's website, because all the webinars are there for you to review offline, if you should so inclined. Well, I'd like to talk today a little bit, just to recap what we covered 2 weeks ago in Data Storytelling Part 1, which is organizing your data and preparing it for presentation to a larger audience. And we talked about grounding, getting your business situation and understanding the context of what's going on around you, and also what's to change if there's an opportunity for improvement in some way, either to achieve some gain or relieve some pain. And your goal of assembling your data, organizing it, and ultimately presenting it is to convince others in your organization that this gain is worth going after, and the effort to change and do some new things or do some things differently is worth it. We don't know exactly what the change goal is going to be necessarily until we've done all of the work of the data science to prove it. But in the early stages, we can use some visual techniques to focus your data and get your messages together. And we talked about 2 weeks ago in understanding the context of what's the business situation and the opportunity look like that's in front of you. And then taking all the different data. Sometimes it's not well organized. We talked about it being sometimes a pile of data that needs to be organized, and how you could put it together into messages and themes that make sense, and to sometimes get rid of data that aren't as relevant, because sometimes you have a lot of extraneous data that if you tried to put into a presentation, it might confuse your audience. So how do you distill and winnow your data and get rid of the things that don't really matter and focus what does matter into key messages? And we used a concept called the mind map, or it's a visual technique to sort data and to group it into themes, and then frame and refining those data and prioritizing what's most important, subordinating some other details through a concept called the concept map. It's a tool, it's a visual tool that you can find online. There's lots of tools that do that. And these are steps that you would want to do if you're just getting your thoughts together and you want to make sure that you've got a reasonable business case. Now, this isn't necessarily the best approach if you have data scientists available to you, because they can take your data and make good sense out of it. But the problem is they're expensive, it takes time, and you don't always have access to those resources, particularly in the early days of getting your thoughts together. So the visual techniques of mind map and concept map are very useful if you want to get your thoughts together quickly and make sure they are directionally accurate and you've got a firm ground to stand on before you make the investment into data scientists. And then the challenge that you have from there on is defining what those messages are and preparing the package for delivery to usually senior executives or perhaps just a larger audience within your company or your organization. The other thing we talked about 2 weeks ago was that there are three parts to a data story. There's the data, of course, the visualizations that you put together to enlighten the data to your audience, the narrative that you use to explain the business situation and your messages, and then putting it all together to inspire your audience within the business context that makes sense to them. And we made the assertion that data require a story because it might not necessarily be obvious from an Excel spreadsheet what the message is. So we need to make sure that we provide a good narrative about that. And also that stories require data, because we might have a very good idea for a new business line or a new business process, but if we don't have data to back it up, it's not worthy or not ready yet for investment. So we need to make sure that we have the evidence to make a compelling narrative. And that narrative is going to say, what is going on in the business today? So what does that mean for perhaps a better future? And if we pursue that future, then what would our business look like? And if you agree with that, now what do we do as next steps of action to make that happen? So that was the context of the data story that we talked about 2 weeks ago. And now our challenge is to bring those messages forward to an audience. So I'm going to take that a little bit out of the business context alone, and I'm going to make sure that we understand that, hey, we're now talking about you delivering this message to an audience of perhaps decision makers, or perhaps there's a people that you need to convince to get on board with your idea of going forward. Because if they don't have the opportunity to understand what your messages are and why you're bringing this case forward, they're not as likely to support it and give you the buy-in that you need to make the difference and move forward and make the change in the business. So we're going to focus the data story within the business context, you delivering it to an audience of decision makers, whether they are senior to you or subordinate to you. They have decision rights of whether they will get on board or not. So what's the best way of going about getting them on board? Well, we want to make sure we provide a good reason for them within, that's the rationale that you'll provide and explain the business context. You want to make the audience care about what you're talking about. So that is the relevance aspect. And then if you deliver a compelling story in a really interesting way that really hits their buttons, then you're going to have it resonate with them and inspire them to action. So that's our objective today, is to cover how we should go about doing that. And if you're in IT in a lot of situations, sometimes IT people are stereotypically, they're introverts, right? And they don't like to get up in front of people, and they have anything but the Tony Robbins gene, right? So sometimes it makes it a little bit challenging for us to do that, to get out of our comfort zone and to get in front of that audience and put on a really dynamic presentation. The challenge is if we don't challenge ourselves to do that, we miss the opportunity from being good at what we do to being great at what we do. So I'd like to take you through some ideas that I have to get from good to great. And the first rule about delivering to an audience is know who they are. Know as much about them as possible. And we'll go through that in the next couple of slides. And then command the room to make sure that you convey your level of confidence to them in a way that is credible and interesting and convincing to them, so that they will believe in you and want to endorse your cause. And then finally, inspire action by painting a beautiful picture of what the future could be and get them to go along with and support your proposal. So the data story part 2 is targeting your audience, knowing how they will present themselves and how you should present to them so that your message will resonate. So you can't just know what your corporate culture is and take it for granted. I encourage you to really think about this in a very deliberate way, and each member of the audience and their personality styles of what types of style that they would react to best, what kind of messages, what are their information needs, what are their communication preferences. Some audiences like to know all of the detail. Some audiences like you to be bright, be brief, and be gone, because they're executives and they just want to know what the headlines are and they assume that you've covered the details. Knowing your audience and whether they want the details or they don't want the details, and that's just one aspect, by the way, is really important for refining your narrative from the what to the so what, the then what, and the now what, because you want to deliver and tailor that message in a way that really resonates to them. And then finally, once you've thought about that and you're ready to go, walking into the room, preparing yourself to be fully present, to have a great style, use body language effectively, handle any types of questions that come up, manage silence, heaven forbid there's a mistake, but how to recover from it, and then we'll talk about closing with an inspiration to action. So what does that really look like? Well, here's the context we've got, and we want to target the audience first. That's the first rule of presenting. So we want to understand them, we want to connect with them, and we want to move them from wherever they are today to something that is aligned with and supportive of what you want to do going forward. So let's talk about resonance and how to resonate with an audience in a way that really will be impactful. And as I said earlier, the first thing is to understand your audience, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. You could do it informally because you think about every individual, and you think about being in meetings with that person in the past and how they expressed their interest or disinterest in a particular topic, how they leaned into a conversation and what types of things made them lean in versus the types of things that made them impatient or perhaps frustrated. And that's an informal way to do that based upon your experience, but there also are formal psychological assessment tools that many companies use, and one of them is from the Insights group called the Discovery Profiles. And this is a test that somebody takes. It takes about perhaps a half an hour. And a lot of organizations have rolled this out throughout their entire organization, and they keep data on the types and the natures of different people in the organization. And many times they classify those based upon level of seniority. So our chief executive officers and the senior staff there, the CXOs in a corporation, they might be predominantly red in their color. They are directors and motivators and perhaps reformers in the company. And then going down through the organization to vice presidents and directors and senior managers and individual contributors, they might be blue. They might be engineers that are part observer and part reformer. Or they may be people who just want to, in a nonprofit organization, they want to help and inspire the communities and make a difference in the world. They have different preferences of how they like to think about things and how they like to engage in communication. And these are preferences, they're not strengths or weaknesses. Doesn't mean they can't look at it another way. It just means it's their preference. So the message here is that human communication is a two-way process. I want to be able to adapt how I present information to them so it meets them at their preference. It makes it easy for them to engage with us. They don't have to struggle and say, oh yeah, I can think about this another way. I want me to be able to deliver to them in a way that is as natural for them to understand as possible. That means if they're the be bright, be brief, be gone type, and I'm an engineer, I have to be very careful about wanting to tell them everything I know as an engineer. I need to tell them only what they need to know to be able to support my recommendation. There are other assessment vehicles that are in the realm of organizational development. Many people have heard about the Myers-Briggs, for example, and here's a portrait of those. The key message for both discovery insights, or maybe you use Enneagram, or maybe you use Myers-Briggs, is to know where you are and to know where your audience is, so that you can transform your style into something that is going to be very accepting, very easy for them to understand and to agree with. So wherever you are, find that out and find out where your audience is. And then you can come into the room and say, I know how to resonate with you. I know how to make messages really understandable for you and accessible. And now I want to make them relevant. So how do I do that? Well, I have to understand not only the what of what's going on, but what that really means and the significance of that to your audience. So I'm going to take my themes, my what, my so what, and note, etc., into key messages that will resonate with them, and then a narrative that will tell the story in a way that really makes a difference to them and makes them want to care, leading up to the proposal for action that will enable them to agree. So what does the relevance look like? Well, I don't want to just tell them what I think is important. I want to answer their question. Every audience, whether you're in a rock concert or you're in a speech or you're in a lecture hall or whatever it is, they're always asking, what's in it for me? Sounds very selfish, but they're really, especially in a presentation like this, senior executives are always saying, why should I care? And you need to answer that question for them. And don't make them work for it. They shouldn't have to deduce what's in it for them. You need to tell them right up front, from their perspective, not yours. What does the proposal mean to each member of the audience? They're all there because they are stakeholders. They might be from different parts of the organization, but all those organizations may be contributing to or perhaps impacted by your proposal. So what are the benefits of that? What are the costs? What are we going to ask them to do? What things might be threatening to them? What things might compromise some other aspects of their organization that have to continue doing their jobs as they always have? And also, what does it mean to them personally? Am I asking them to go out on a limb? And if so, how am I going to provide the support and make sure there's a safety net beneath that limb so that if things don't go as planned, as perfectly, then they'll still be okay in the organization? And then be very clear. What changes are you proposing and why? Why is it in their interest to do that? And then think in advance. Who is going to say, who's going to challenge me? Who's going to ask me what about this? That I better be able to have a solid answer and be able to address this. Now, sometimes you might have seen a press conference where somebody asks a politician, well, what about this? And the politicians dodge the question. They don't answer. They answer a different question. They stick to their talking points. Well, we're not in politics, or at least not in this context of this webinar. You don't have the luxury of answering a different question. You really need to think in advance and perhaps ask your coworkers, who's going to have challenge to this and what are the tough questions that I'm going to be getting, so that you can think about those in advance. Maybe even put those objections up on a slide and say, hey, I know you're probably wondering about this, so you can mitigate those concerns right off the bat so that people don't come undermining you either in the room or later, which sometimes can be even worse. Make sure you know how to respond. So back to the point about expressing significance. How do we do that? Well, here's a couple of examples of, here's the what and the so what. I might be talking about a handheld computer, but 11 or 12 years ago when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, you didn't say it's a handheld computer, guys, look at this, isn't this cool, I'm such a nerd, right? Steve Jobs, one of the most effective presenters of all time, said this is what it means to you. This is a phone, and it's a music player, and it's a browser in your pocket, not just a handheld computer. it's something that is really cool for you. Another example is I might have an application for updating my friends and family. That's not what Facebook sells. That's not what LinkedIn or Twitter or Snapchat sell. They talk about sharing lives and community and connecting relationships with people in a way that you might not be able to because they're not with you. You can only do it with their app. So that is a great message of the so what it means to me. Another example, looking at a company based here in Denver, Colorado, Pearl Izumi doesn't just sell athletic apparel. They say, here's where, with our apparel, you can have an adventure through bicycling. And they show their ads in action wear, not just on mannequins, right? Give them a good time. And then there's another nonprofit here based in Denver that has a lot of data about Denver and how great a place it is to live and work. They don't just provide the data. They have messaging, Downtown Denver Partnership, that this is a great place for retail establishments, this is a great place for commercial establishments. It's a great place to gather in the city center. It's a great place to live and work and to come and meet and socialize with other people. So the message is not just the what, but what it really means to them to help it resonate with your audience so they can get inspired about what's in front of them, right? And then we're going to put together the slide deck. And the 10 commandments of preparation of a slide deck. No more than 20 slides. No more than 20 minutes. Make it quick. No more than 3 bullets per slide, except when you're presenting 10 commandments. And no more than 1 or 2 graphics per slide. Keep them simple. Talk to your audience, not your slides. And don't read your slides unless you're presenting a webinar. You want to go through the point by point. Make sure you rehearse, that you've got it down. You know what you're going to say about each bullet point. You know what your transition is to the next slide. You know where you're taking them, and you're very deliberate and conscious in doing that. And you're eliminating a lot of the ums and ands and ers and stutters that can undermine the momentum that you're trying to build to get them to say yes. And of course, check the venue. Make sure you have the right connectors to be able to plug into whatever display equipment you're going to be using. Make sure you leave time for Q&A. Don't leave people wanting less. This is when somebody crams a 5-minute message into a 30-minute meeting. You don't want to do that. If it's a 5-minute message, take 5 minutes and then use the rest for discussion and Q&A. That will get the audience engaged. If they just sat there and listened and said thank you and you can leave, I don't think you really stirred them to action. What we want to do is, if possible, present in 10 minutes. If I got 20 minutes of time, present in 10 and have 10 minutes of audience Q&A and discussion and get people developing the thoughts forward so that they can see and make it really make sense to them and they can feel good about it. And they can't really always feel good about it if they're just sitting back passively in the room and you haven't given them the chance to ask questions or really discuss the topic in more detail. So don't leave them wanting less. Make sure you give them plenty of time to get their thoughts out. Even if it's at the expense of some of your points, if they're going along with you, you can stay silent on the details. So don't leave them wanting less. And I said on the previous slide, no more than 20 slides. Here's what I recommend is you've got the title page, background, proposal, what, so what, then what, etc. And you can fit that into 11 slides. If you can do that, this is a situation when you're proposing something new where less can be more. And you really want to be able to get the discussion going, and you don't want to bore them with a lot of slides. The maximum that I'll put on the other side of the slide is you can go up to 20, and sometimes you might have some extra details that you might want to put in. But many times it's better to put those details in an appendix. And if someone asks a question, you can skip forward to that appendix and say, here's the slide. I thought somebody might ask about that. Here it is. And you can jump forward and show that you've been prepared rather than spending too much time up front trying to convince them if they're already convinced. So keep it short. Even if it's at the expense of details, you can always provide those details orally when they ask rather than risk boring them if they're not interested. So then our challenge is to walk into the room and command that room. And as I said, I'm an IT guy. I know what it's like to be nervous in front of a crowd, intimidated in front of the senior executives and those kinds of things. It's hard to overcome. But what I want to do is give you some guidance here of what has worked for me in case that would be useful to you going forward. So the goal here is to be relevant, as we talked earlier, be visionary, paint a great picture of the future, be committed and absolutely convinced that you are right. Be authentic, be yourself, because they know what you like. They've seen you in the hallways. They've probably been in meetings with you in the past. They know if you're going to try to be a completely different person just today, that won't work because they'll know that it's not authentic. So you need to just be yourself, be very calm and deliberate about it, but still be yourself. And then be brief, especially with an executive audience, right? Here's the question. What does it take to do all that? Easily said. Well, let's talk about what it takes to have it be done. Command and charisma. Not everybody has a natural charisma, but I believe charisma is something that can be learned over time through practice. So you might not be the best orator to start, but if you practice and you go in front of enough audiences, you will become better. And the way to do that is by being yourself. It's just you up there, be yourself. Be unafraid because you're convinced you have a good message. Connect with them, talk to them. Don't just talk at them and run through your presentation. Pace it properly, be fully present, breathe to make sure that you're not rushing, to make sure that you're picking up on the nuance of the room and seeing if people's arms are crossed or whether their eyes are rolling or whether their eyes are closed. That's even worse. But to be able to read that audience and be very grounded in your material, know exactly what you're doing, and make eye contact with them. Most proposals like this aren't in front of a crowd of 150 people. They're usually in a group of maybe 5 or 8 executives. There is enough ability and time in the room to make eye contact with each one of them and to hold that eye contact and show them that you care about their presence, that you care about their time, and you care about gaining their support. All right, but what does it take to be able to do that? It all sounds well and good on paper. Let's walk into the room. The foundation of a data story is that you really have the confidence in it because you've done your research, you've thought about this thoroughly, you've talked to other people about it, you've defended it, and you have really good conviction that what you have to say matters. And it matters to that audience, it matters to your organization, and it matters to you. And that conviction is really built on the fact that you have done some solid preparation. You've done the data sorting, you've done the thinking about what their objections might be, you've been thinking about your audience individually. You are solidly prepared because you've done your research and you are situationally aware of what's going on in the business and what's going on in the minds of that audience. So you've got a great foundation for your data story. And at that point, you can proceed with the delivery to walk into the room, lead to success, and celebrate that success when you're done. But the key message for those who are wondering about how can I do this, how do I get that confidence? If you look at this stair step and this solid foundation of multiple layers, you realize that confidence is a decision, not an emotion. It's a decision that something else is more important than your fear, that your fear is not as important as your message and the organization's acting on that message to get to a better tomorrow. So if you think about it in terms of, hey, I'm really nervous when I go into a room, and then you step back and say, but this really matters. This is really for the betterment of the organization, and this is important. And you know what? I can put my emotions aside for a few minutes to be able to carry the day. So I encourage you to think about confidence perhaps a different way than you thought about it in the past. So with more confidence, gravitas. Do you have the solidity and the perseverance to go in and do that? How do you be focused and deliberate? Communicate. No mixed signals. Be knowing exactly what your message is and you're serious about it. Orchestrate your rhythms. Don't just rush. Sometimes you'll pause at the end of a sentence to let it sink in. And that might sound like a long silence. But sometimes people really need to think about and absorb your message. You can use gestures, not for everything, but at certain times, and you practice this. Use your movement strategically. I've seen none other than Steve Ballmer, the chairman of Microsoft, pacing back and forth on a stage like he was a caged tiger. He wasn't using movement strategically, and it subtracted from his message. So you can lean into the audience, you can walk around a little bit, but keep it moderate. And if there's a podium there, I encourage you to get out from behind the podium so that you can connect with your audience a little bit better, so you're more accessible, so you're not hiding from them and have something between you and them, which implies that you have something to hide. We don't want that in any circumstance. Appropriate use of eye contact, and don't make statements sound like questions, because when you make a statement sound like a question, it sounds like you're not really sure, or maybe you didn't think about it before, and that's not a good audio cue to your audience, that you're convinced and convicted about what you're talking about. So end your sentences with sentences, not as questions. And then the biggest bugaboo for many people is saying, it's kind of like this, and well, if it's kind of like that, it implies that it's not really 100% like that. So don't say kind of like, say this is it. And it's got a little bit more gravitas to it than an idea. It's actually a proposal. So here's a web reference. I'd encourage you to see one of the TED Talks from Julian Treasure, How to Speak So That People Want to Listen. It's about 9 or 10 minutes, well worth your time. So a little plug for Julian Treasure there. And then you're in the room and you've got body language. You want to have dominant physical postures. You don't want your shoulders hunched. You don't want to be leaning over. You don't want to be resting on something and leaning on something. You want to stand on both feet slightly apart. Don't cross your ankles. A lot of people do this and they don't realize it. And now that I've mentioned it to you, you'll probably notice that people do this more than you noticed in the past. But it conveys an informality. And if you're asking people to adopt a new proposal that is really significant, you don't want to be informal about it. You don't have to be rigid, but you don't want to be informal about it. So you want to stand tall, take up your space with an open torso, put your arms away from your sides, not in your pockets. Big sin for a lot of guys, especially if they have coins in their pockets. You can put one hand in a pocket, don't put both. These are little details that subtract from your message if you commit these minor little sins. Gesture with intent and engaged eye contact, particularly when you're making a strong point. If you make a point and then you avoid everybody's eyes, that tells them that you're not sure about it, that you're not confident about it, that you don't have the strength to stand up in full presence for everything that you're saying. So practice that. It's hard, but take the time to do that. And if you're not an eye contact person, you're going to have to work on it. Work on it with, your best buddy at work, perhaps your partner, significant other. There's lots of ways to do that, but it takes practice. And if you want to be humble and deprecate yourself and make a joke, do it with words. Don't do it physically with a submissive posture. So it's okay to say it and move on, but don't act it that way. Okay. So the day of, you're going to walk into this room. You are well prepared, well rehearsed, dressed like a leader. That you're going to be as well dressed or maybe one notch above the people in the audience. Conveys respect for yourself and for them. And then adopt the warrior pose. Now this sounds kind of funny. This is Muhammad Ali here on the right. The warrior pose, there's neuroscience that shows if we stand up with our hands like Muhammad Ali here has, and we do that for 2 minutes with tall posture and we breathe deeply, that improves our self-confidence. Now, I wouldn't do it in the front of the room when everybody's watching. I would do it in the restroom before you go into the room. And you can stand there, and if you can do it in front of the mirror, it's great. Or find a private space. Maybe it's your office before you go upstairs. But ideally, within 10 minutes of when you go on and go live, do this, and it will improve your performance. Sounds silly, but I want to give you every tip that I found has worked well for me and for others who I've talked to in developing these techniques. And then finally, you want to show up and set up early so that you've got everything smooth and running, so you have no fumbles and no awkward pauses or anything else like that. And then 1, 2, 3, go. You're live, you're in it, and you're getting them on your side. So pull it together. A data story is a compelling narrative supported by data and leading to action, delivered in a way that inspires your audience to support your proposal. So you start with the why, proceed to the what, the so what, the then what, the now what, and you carry the day with the successful message. It is the bridge to adoption. Once you have a great idea, you use a data story to get people on board, and then you can start to implement great things. So I encourage you to think about these. Lean into accepting the challenge of going from good to great, and then see if you have any questions. I'd be glad to answer any that you have. So thank you for listening, and I hope this leads you to a better presentation style.
Great. Thank you so much, Chad. That's great. So many good tips and tricks, and even if some of them seem simple or maybe even silly to some, I think that they're so valuable. So I really appreciate that. I had a question for you, and this is a real life scenario, right? So
Right.
I'm genuinely asking you this question. So you talked about, knowing your audience, right? And as you know from being an executive many years, there's strong differences between IT leadership and what they want to see in a presentation, and business leadership and what they want to see in a presentation. So what we are encountering is that in a lot of our data governance council meetings, we find we have both in the room. Mm-hmm. And it's really a challenge, right? How do you give enough technical detail, but yet tell the story so that it can resonate with the business? I'm curious what advice you have when you've got a mixed audience like that.
Well, that's one of the more challenging situations, Deborah, and you're right, I've been in a lot of them. And knowing who is in the audience is really key, and knowing that they've got differences, and just saying right up front, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. And I imagine from the operations perspective, you're going to wonder about these aspects. From the CFO's perspective, you're always going to wonder how much it's going to cost and what's the return on investment. From IT, how are you going to bill it? And you can say there's lots of different ways to look at this, and they all fit together, and here's how. But you have to put it on the table right up front, because you can't say that there's only one way to look at this when there's three different perspectives in the room, right? So you just say it right up front. So here's what I'm here to propose, and this is pretty, in some ways, nuanced and complex, and I just recognize right up front that it means different things to different people in the audience, because I need you to do different things from your perspective to make this work. So I get back to first of all, I acknowledge it right up front, and then I get to the with them from each person. What's in it for me in the room? And a lot of times they'll say, you're right, that's true about me, but I hadn't thought about the impacts on another person in the room. And I want to talk about that in a little bit more detail, because that affects how we interact, or how we're going to come together to support your proposal. And you can get that discussion going too, which is even better. So you've moved it from acknowledgement of multiple stakeholders to engaging them to start solving the problem, to start working on the implementation and getting their heads around what it's going to take. And if you can move from skepticism that this doesn't matter to me to engagement, that's your goal. And the way to do that is just acknowledge it right up front and put it out there.
Great, great, very good. Great advice. I would guess that with any sort of presentation, there's a goal in mind. Whether it's an all-hands company meeting, a town hall, a readout from an assessment, a business case to earn funding, whatever the case, there's always a goal, right? There's always a goal in mind.
You should have a goal. That's why you're there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like with audience, typically we find, audiences, especially at the executive level, are typically between 12 to 20, right? That's typically your audience. Is there anything that you would tweak or do differently should it be a town hall and you don't have 20 people in the room, you have 2,000 or more, right? Anything that you would suggest that they do differently?
Well, it's very different from presenting in front of a large crowd to a small, intimate conference room. Obviously, you can't make eye contact with 1,000 people in the room, right? In that situation, your goal, you have to express whatever, you have to be very clear about what your goal is. You have to know what that is right up front. And you have to express it in the corporate context. how does this relate to the strategies, the business mission, the business vision, and the major operations and major projects that are going on in the business? Because the people in the audience generally understand what the business vision, mission, and goals are, right? And then that is the common denominator for that audience. It's a very large common denominator because it's a very large audience. But you have to start from where they are and then make your goal relevant to them. Say why I'm doing this, how this relates to the big picture, and then you can proceed to the what's in it for them. And if we are able to do this, adopt your proposal, it's going to make us better. It's going to take us further on our corporate goals. It's going to accelerate our strategies. It's going to engage our customers. It's going to, whatever it is, then you can couch the then what in terms of the strategic context of the organization. Now, if you have a very small, modest goal and you can't relate it directly to the audience or to the corporate goals, I would say you have two challenges. One, if you can't relate what you're doing to the corporate goal, you need to rethink what your goal is, number one. Number two, if you have a small piece of the pie, it's unlikely you'd be in a town hall of 1,000 people, right? And if it comes up that somebody's hosting a town hall, ask a question about your goal and what you're doing, and it is relevant to perhaps 20% of the audience, then you'll be called up front. You'll have to answer that question, and you've got about a minute or two at most to explain what it is you're doing and why it relates to them, and then offer to follow up with others later rather than drag it out for the other 80% of the audience that might not be quite as interested.
Okay. Okay, good. What if someone follows all these steps to the best of their ability and they feel like they're stepping into a meeting and they're commanding the room and they're ready to inspire, and as they start to go about the presentation, they start to see verbal and nonverbal cues that the audience is not engaged. Mm-hmm. They're on their laptops, they're checking their phones, they're disengaged. Any advice for, should someone find themselves in that situation, what they should do?
One of the toughest, Deborah, that's a great question, Deborah. It's one of the toughest situations. There's two really tough situations. One is you lose them, and the other is you step in it, right? Mm-hmm. And you make a major mistake or a faux pas. Mm-hmm. If you make a faux pas, just acknowledge it and move on. Say, I'm sorry, my bad, and just move on. I didn't mean to say that. What I meant to say was something else, right? If you're in a situation where they are disengaging, then that's where you really need to emphasize the with them and say, I know you guys got a lot on your plate right now. I know you've got a lot of things competing for your attention. But again, I lean right into it and deal with it explicitly and say, well, let me cut to the chase. Here's why I really like your attention right now. And here's what it means to you. And then let's discuss it. And we can come back to it later in another time if we need to. It's essentially calling them out on it. But you really have to reassert your command of the room and do that in a way that is deferential if it's a senior audience. And say, I recognize there's a lot of competition for your time. Let me cut to the chase. And you try to make it very brief and compelling and make it really meaningful to them. And you should practice that in advance, that if you have to cut your 20-minute pitch down to 3 or 5, what would that summary be, that executive summary be? Because you might need to pull it out of your hip pocket when they start reading emails or looking at their cell phones or all those, let's face it, they are discourteous behaviors, but doesn't mean the senior people won't do it on you sometimes, and maybe subordinates too. And that's a challenge. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Throughout the deck, there is a resonating theme, I would say. And if I had to distill it down, one of those major themes would be inspire, that you mention quite often. You don't say solicit change, get agreement for change. You say inspire them to do something. Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to inspire?
Oh my goodness. A lot of times it depends on the audience, of course, but there's an old saying from clinical psychologists that how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? 'Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. Right? And because when you tell people to change, it doesn't usually get the traction. You want to inspire them to change. So it comes down to how tomorrow could be better than today, and painting that picture in a way that they can relate to, that really resonates with them. And say, let's face it, our process today is inefficient, or we get cranky customers on the phone, and none of that's fun. And you can relate to their pain, or you can relate to their desire for doing something better and differently tomorrow. And say, imagine a world if. Now, you might not say it that way, but you can say with the then what, which is what the beautiful future would look like, and say, if we were to change this, let's imagine what that would look like. And I could say, this pain will go away, that pain will go away, you'll get home, you'll be able to leave the office in time to get home for dinner with, your spouse and family. You'll be able to, so sometimes it's making it personal to them, and sometimes it's business, and usually it's a combination of both. And you can say, if we can get there, here's what it's going to be. And sometimes just letting that hang in the air and using that moment of silence and saying, just imagine the possibilities. Now, if some of you other folks in the room, and I could ask this right up front, what does this mean to you? Or is there something else you could imagine that might be even better? And you start to get them engaged, and they provide their own inspiration. Wow, that's really cool. That, hey, if I could get home from work on time, imagine all the other things I'd be able to do. And they could come up with those scenarios themselves. So you sometimes posing the question to them and saying, hey, if we got to this, how would it be better for you? And maybe some other people might be able to build on that and engage in them. Because the more engagement you can get, the more inspired the more they can see themselves in that situation, and then more likely adopt what you're talking about.
Great. Good. We're going to do one more question, and then we'll close things out. So I want your opinion on this, because I'm reading this book, Talk Like TED. And basically what they've done is they have done some analysis on some of the greatest TED Talks. You had mentioned Steve Jobs, and there's a number of them that they highlight. And one of the things that they call out is what we're talking about here today, backing it up with facts, right? Have your data, have it be organized, have it be compelling, have it be succinct, right? Bright, brief, be gone. And one of the other things that they call out is working in a story. And I think that that's kind of what you're saying when you talk about making it personal, right? Talk about something that everyone can relate to, right? Like you say, going home and being on time for dinner, that's something that everyone who works a lot of hours can relate to, right? How hard that is to do sometimes. So how often, when you are doing a data-driven presentation with a lot of facts and data to back up your inspiration to change, would you recommend working in some sort of story, compelling story related to the data, or would you stay away from that and just focus on what the data is sharing?
Very good question, Deborah, and thank you. And perhaps I didn't emphasize it enough in my recap this morning of our session from 2 weeks ago. But when you build up the what and the so what, the what is the current business situation that they're all dealing with today, and they should be able to relate to that. So what is the thing that makes it really resonate with them? The implication could be on the business, it could be on their lives, it could be on both, it could be on finances, it could be on salary, it could be on any of those topics. Because typically a situation that involves great opportunity or great pain, or perhaps both, typically has a so what that goes in lots of different directions. It covers lots of different foundations. It could be personal, it could be financial, it could be mission and values of the company, it could be relocation topics, whatever it is you're talking about. Spread it out as widely as possible to hit as many members of the audience as possible, so that they can say, yeah, that's me. Yeah, that affects me. Yeah, I wish we could fix that, dang it. And then you've got their attention. And the so what is really setting the hook for that. And then you paint the better future, how you're going to make all that better. And then the now what is, okay, here's the action plan to move forward. So that's a great perspective on it, making it work. Thank you.
Good. Great. Okay, well, with that, we're going to put up on the screen our next educational webinar series. It's going to be Healthcare Provider MDM meaning Master Data Management, and that will be held on Thursday, May 10th at 11 a.m. Mountain. We find this window works really well across the many time zones as far as people that are attending. And so we're really hoping that you will tune into that. It's going to have a bit of a payer focus with regards to provider information, and then we will have a follow-on for providers mastering provider data. Now that's a tongue twister, right, Jen?
Something they need to do though. So I'm going to be in the audience on this one.
Good. And our last slide is, our contact information. And once again, just a huge thank you to Jed for taking the time to spend this hour with us, and also the hour for part one. We really appreciate it. For everyone in attendance, we have recorded this session. It will be available on our website, datasourceconsulting.com. Other information that you'll find there, boy, we do like 30 of these webinars plus a year. We do white papers, we do blogs. There is a ton of content around enterprise data management and analytics, tips and tricks around data virtualization, how to master your data, data quality, methodology. I mean, you name it. It is just a gold mine for information for all of those that work in the data space. In addition to that, I would just like to mention that, Jed and Datasource Consulting, we offer this service, right? If you need help telling your story and really distilling down the data to make a compelling and inspiring, get that? Inspiring case for the action to change, we would be happy to hold a workshop and help you do that. So that's our job as consultants.
A lot of senior leaders call us in to help their staff learn how to do this, to present to them and to present to other senior executives. So it might be for you, it might be for your staff, or from some other support personnel around your organization.
Absolutely. I cannot think of anyone at any level that couldn't benefit from having these tools in their tool belt. Absolutely. Regardless of where they are in their career. So executive all the way down to, the worker bees. These are great skills to have. So with that, thank you again. Thank you everyone so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on May 10th. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.